welcome you all to the Grosse Pointe Central Branch. Once again, this is one of our historical lecture series that we have begun. I see a couple of you here from previous times. And this is our second time we've done this now. I want to make a few announcements. On Thursday, February 21st, we're going to have Dr. Greg Sumner. He's going to be talking about the Michigan POW camps in World War II, a book he wrote. And then again, on Thursday, March 21st, we're going to have the 82nd Airborne's historian, former historian, Stephen Mrozek. He's going to be talking about a lecture called Descending from the Clouds, Parachuting Glider Troops in World War II. So hopefully we can get some of you to come out to that as well. Tonight, our presenter is Chris Causley. His lovely wife Wendy is filming for us back there. Chris is a founding member and current president of the Michigan Military Technical and Historical Society in East Point, Michigan, and a commissioner on the State of Michigan World War I Centennial Commission. A longtime collector and historian, he has narrowed his focus to capture and preserve the story of Michigan's contributions to the defense of the nation from 1900 through today. The Michigan Military Technical and Historical Society is dedicated to preserving the stories of Michigan citizens who served and sacrificed here and abroad from World War I to the present. Their 11,000 square feet museum exhibits the actual equipment, weapons, uniforms, and other artifacts that bear witness to the high cost of freedom. We have brochures for the museum on the tables here and outside. The museum is a really fascinating place to visit, and I really encourage you all to stop there if you get a chance sometime. Okay, and here's our presenter, Chris.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I can attest the two speakers he spoke of, Steve Mrozek and Professor Sumner, both very good speakers. So. And if you don't want to wait, you can come see Professor Sumner at the museum this Sunday. Don't want to steal your car out. All right, so my name is Chris Causley. I am from the Michigan Military Technical and Historical Society Museum in East Point. We are on Stevens Road, just east of Thrasher. If you haven't been there, please come check us out. And tonight we'll be talking what I like to call the dress rehearsal for the arsenal of democracy. The role Michigan and Michigan's industry played in war production for the First World War. So a couple of things I really want to lay some groundwork, a couple of things to consider. In 1914, 15, 16, 17, the United States was a vastly different place from what it is today. Everybody in this room, I can attest, is a product of the United States as a world superpower. I don't think there's anybody in this room that's old enough to remember the pre-World War II isolationist, and especially the pre-World War I isolationist United States as it existed. So you have to kind of put yourself in the mindset and really kind of bear in mind where they started from in 1917, the United States entered the war, and maybe if you go back to 1914, when the world really plunged into war. So a few points to consider. 1917, Americans still held a very strong mistrust of a standing army. It's one, we all grew up with George Washington as the general. George Washington and many of the founding fathers did not believe a standing army was a prudent thing. The whole taxation without representation, I mean, how many people here know what was the root cause of that taxation without representation? The French and Indian War. And they believed that if you have a standing army, the generals and the military will find reasons to go to war to justify their existence. George Washington once said that military contractors were enough to make one curse their own species. So you can kind of see where he was coming from. In 1914, the United States was not a military power, not at all. Military spending was not a priority whatsoever. It was mostly defensive, and it almost all went to the Navy. The Army, the Air Force obviously didn't exist yet, and the Army only got money when we actually declared war. And isolationism was the order of the day. So this is an actual quote. A lot of the research that was done from this was drawn from an actual government document that was printed in 1919. There's copies of it from the book, which we will have for sale later if anyone wants them. I took the time to transcribe it. So, but this is right from there, and it really kind of lays out that at that point in time, having a standing military in what we would now call a military-industrial complex was fundamentally illegal. So you went to war, you stood up an army, the war ended, you stood down the army. Not to start any arguments, but regulated militia, Second Amendment, that is actually what they were meaning, the modern interpretation of the Constitution. So that's actually from the book. It was done in 1920 by the Government Printing Office. They did a whole series. They did 13 volumes. They broke the country up into 13 ordnance districts, and each district had a book chronicling what it did. A lot of what I did here is from the actual the Detroit Ordnance District history. So by the time the United States entered World War I in 1917, the Europeans had been killing each other for 3 years. They had brought it to they brought it to a science, they brought it to an art. And we were woefully behind the curve. Most of the weapons that we would go to war with in World War I were not American weapons, they were European weapons. They were weapons that were designed by the French and the British. We just didn't have time. Once we declared war in 1917, we just said, we went to the British and the French and we're like, okay, show us what you got and teach us how to do this trench warfare thing. So again, out of the book is a very, they said it's an astounding fact that the United States went from 0 to 100 in a matter of 18 months. We were involved in the war for 18 months. Most of the stuff that we produced here would never make it into combat. By the time the industry spooled up, we figured out what to make, how much to make, who was going to make it, how to make it, the war was over. We were planning for a major military offensive in the spring of 1919, and that was where all of the stuff that we were building here was going to be sent over to England, sent over to France, it was going to be stockpiled for this major military push that was going to occur in the spring of 1919. In October of 1918, Germany collapses economically. And they call it the October Revolution. It's well outside the scope of what we're talking about here tonight, but that is really what laid the groundwork for the Second World War, is because they defeated themselves economically and politically from the inside. Their army was actually still advancing. They were never defeated soundly in the field. So a lot of the German military kind of had a little bitter feeling from that. But we have to bear in mind that most of the stuff we were making was intended for this major offensive that was scheduled for the spring fighting season, 1919, and that never happened. There we go. So one of the things that I know was on the flyer, and I kind of added this because this is from another presentation that I do that's more directly on that book. At this point in time, there was no central procurement. Once again, the United States government was not a military power. So you had the Ordnance Corps, the Quartermaster Corps, the Chemical Corps, that all had their own procurement arms, and then you had the Navy. The Navy was actually well funded because it was considered a defensive force. And so the Navy the Navy went into World War I quite well prepared. They had a lot of contracts in place, they had buyers out there, and then when the Army hit the ground running, they realized that they were competing with the Navy. And not only were they competing with the Navy, they were competing with each other. And that's what kind of led to a more centralized procurement system, which really was the foundation of what we see today with Army Materiel Command and the Pentagon and things of that nature. That didn't exist then. It was chaos. Everybody was going in different directions. There was no standardization. It was very interesting, and everything was it was actually kind of centralized. Everything was run out of Washington. And they realized really, really quickly that they could not manage everything from Washington. And that's where the 13 ordnance districts came from. And then the Detroit Ordnance District, which covered, kind of give you the idea of how important Michigan was. The Detroit Ordnance District, actually we'll do this. The Detroit Ordnance District covered Michigan. I mean, look at the rest of them. Look at the St. Louis Ordnance District. So that kind of gives you an idea of just how important the Michigan was in this whole grand scheme, and what the industrial capability of this state was. And that was primarily because the auto industry had centered itself here and it was well established in this state by that point in time. So that is actually one of the smaller ones. I mean, obviously some of the older, Boston and things of that nature, which some of the original colonies that were much more industrialized. But for the western western districts, Detroit district was fairly compact. So what made American industry stand out in 1914, when the Europeans went to war? Why did the Europeans had already come to the Americans, asking us to build things for them, for the war. We weren't first supplying the Germans or the Axis powers, or the Central powers as they were called at that time, but we were supplying the British and the French. Very simply, it was the American system of manufacturing. I mean, we had, by that point in time, created a manufacturing system, which, if you in the field, it's called the American system. Mass production, moving assembly line, where you can make things with interchangeable parts, you make them quickly, and you can make them with relatively unskilled labor. So just repetition, over. Europeans were still making stuff on a very craftsman basis, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Some people refer to it as Fordism. Despite what popular culture tells us, Henry Ford did not invent mass production. He took it to another level. He claimed a lot of credit for it. He gets a lot of credit for things he didn't do in general. But he really, his name's attached to it, through history and popular culture. But a lot of people came ahead of him. Eli Whitney, Samuel Colt, Isaac Singer. Isaac Singer did a lot with mass production. Cyrus McCormick, they all did some of it. And a lot of these people had connections to Ford in one way, shape, form, or another. Or people who, like Knudsen, when he came to the United States from Denmark, he worked briefly for Singer before he came to Michigan, and went to work for Ford, and brought a lot of the ideas that he learned, and Ford, of course, just ran with them. So the origins of mass production. Where did mass production come from? Anybody got any ideas?
Standardized parts of firearms.
You know your history, don't you?
Well, there was a Springfield Armory.
Yes.
No.
So in the really for the Mexican-American War, the Ordnance Department realized that weapons broke in the field, you couldn't fix them. You couldn't. It was a pain in the butt. So they really started to kind of look at it, and Springfield Arsenal began developing the idea of making interchangeable parts for firearms. And right about on the dawn of the Civil War, the war between the states, the war of Northern aggression, depending on your particular tastes, Civil War, that was really the norm. And the Europeans were sending people over here to look at how the Springfield Army was building stuff. And I mean, they were already eyeballing us then. So we'll get to the actual topic here. We've got enough background. So Michigan, as you saw with the little map, was very important. And what we did here was incredibly varied. We built a lot of stuff. And we can talk about a couple of them. Sparks and Withington made helmet shells like the one over there. They cast hand grenade bodies, like this guy here. White Star Knitting. There was a lot of clothing production in the state at that time still. So you had they made everything from underwear meat cans, mess gear. I mean, there's way too much to cover in the time that we have allocated tonight. So we're going to look at a couple of specific examples that are really good ones, that really kind of show how World War I laid the groundwork for what we did 25 years later in the Second World War. So number one, you got Ford in the Eagle boat. And that's the Eagle boat there. They were not very pretty ships, but they worked. So Henry Ford, you look at him up sometimes in the First World War, they call him the fighting pacifist. Anybody here familiar with his peace ship? That was a pretty funny story. That's a presentation all by itself. You know, World War I starts in Europe in 1914. Ford is like, that's just ridiculous. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to tell those people to stop. So he gets himself a boat, he puts a whole bunch of rich people on it, heads over, they lose a couple of them to the Spanish flu. They almost lost 4 to the Spanish flu on board the ship. He gets over to Europe and he's like, you know, wants an audience with all the kings and queens and whatever, and they look at him like, go back home. And and they laughed him out of the country. But it's an interesting tale. I guess you got to give them some credit for trying, even. So, the United States enters into the First World War, and President Wilson called up Ford and said, hey, I need your help, I need your expertise, I need your production capability. And one of the things that we had, the problems that we had coming into World War I is we have this brand new thing called submarine warfare. I mean, submarines have been around since the Revolutionary War, but World War I, the Germans really took it to a whole nother, and kicked it in, and it was a major problem. And so we had anti-submarine warfare, brand new thing. And we needed anti-submarine warfare, and we needed ships that could chase down subs. The Navy was looking at 21 different designs and types of anti-submarine warfare vessels. And Ford was like, you know, why don't you just pick one and build a bunch of them? And the Navy's like, you can't mass produce boats, it doesn't work. But they tried. So in January 1918, the Ford Motor Company accepted a contract to build 1 to 500 submarine chasers. Nobody thought it could be done. They all kind of laughed at him. It was a 200-foot-long, 615-ton vessel. It was not designed by the Ford Motor Company. This ship was designed by the Navy. But Ford made a couple of suggestions on how to change it. He made some suggestions about how the engine layout and power plant. But his biggest thing was he wanted to make the ship out of flat plate steel as opposed to rolled steel. And all of the maritime people like, that will never work. Flat plate steel is not seaworthy. That ship will never remain upright in heavy seas. It turned out that they were all wrong. They did. They actually served quite well. Right about that time, Ford had acquired a piece of land on the Rouge River, and the very first building of the Rouge Complex, Building 1, was built specifically to produce the Eagle boat. So, you know, Ford broke ground, and they began building the sub-assemblies in other places, Highland Park. They set up a shuttle service to bring workers, because nobody lived near Rouge at that time, there was nothing out there. So they actually set up a shuttle service. They built an entire infrastructure to build these ships. And very much like both the tank plant and the bomber plant in the Second World War, the first finished ship came off the end of that production line before the building behind it was actually fully completed. So the results of this whole endeavor was that Eagle boats 1 and 2 were actually accepted by the Navy prior to the armistice, and 3 and 4 were signed over to the Navy on the 14th, so 3 days after the armistice. For those of you who are interested in trivia, none of the Eagle boats obviously saw service in the First World War, but 8 of them did remain in the Navy and served in the Second World War, primarily as trainers. One Eagle boat, number 56, was sunk by a German submarine in 1945 off the coast of Maine. So even that ship almost made it to the end of the war. This is probably one of the last ships sunk before the war ended. So only one Eagle boat was lost in combat. It was lost in the different war.
How many were made?
Do I have the number? They had 100. They didn't make the full 100, but I forget the actual number.
Do I have it in here?
I don't have it in my notes. Sorry. But the lesson that came out of this whole thing is that there was proof of concept. Ford proved that you could mass produce large seagoing vessels. And then 25 years later, you had William Kaiser, building the Liberty ships. Right here in Michigan, you had Defoe Shipbuilding. That Defoe Shipbuilding built their ships upside down so that you could weld down on the hull instead of welding over your head. And then when the hull was done, they rolled it over and put it in the water. So I mean, they proved this, but without Ford coming in here and telling all these people, you know what, you can mass produce a ship. You do not have to do this the old-fashioned way. And if you think about it, they signed the contract January of 1918. November of 1918, they delivered 4 ships. Most of your traditional shipbuilders are just barely laid a keel by then. So I mean, this was a major step forward. One of the other areas where Michigan played a role was in aviation. So the United States, we were the birthplace of powered flight. We had the Wright brothers and all that, but the French were actually right behind us. The French were really in the aviation, and they were really neck and neck with us. The Wright brothers beat everybody to the punch, but the French ran with it. The French and the British both ran with aviation. And here in the United States, it kind of stated a novelty, and it was kind of cute and fun and something that rich people did. But in Europe, they really, you had the channel races and all kinds of stuff like that. And then when the war started, they're like, hey, we can kill each other with these things. So, and then they really took off. And so they were way, way, way ahead of us. The Army Air Corps really had been relegated to as a subsection of the Signal Corps. We did use some aircraft in 1916 in the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa. Anybody here know the Michigan-related trivia that connected to that? Byron Q. Jones he flew the Jenny, the JN-4, which was the primary American aircraft at that time. It fell down more than it stayed up. It was not a particularly good plane. But Byron Q. Jones was the first American aviator to take fire in an aircraft. He was flying over Mexico, and the Pancho Villa's bandits, or whatever you want to call them, on the ground, took a couple of pot shots at him. So he became the first American pilot to be shot at in an airplane. Byron Q. Jones would go on to become the first commander of Selfridge Air Base when it was created in 1917. So in the United States after the war, the aviation section had 52 officers, 1,100 enlisted, and 200 civilians. Even then, they had them pesky government employees, civilian employees. I can say that because I am one. And civil servants are everywhere. But of these about 2,000 people, there were 26 that were actually pilots. I mean, that's not, we're going into a global conflict. We've got 26 pilots. And our aircraft were terrible. The JN-4 was a terrible plane. So they decided that the fighter aircraft, they would leave it over in Europe. The Europeans, the French, most of what we went to war with was the SPAD, the French aircraft. The first aircraft stationed at Selfridge were French built. And the United States would focus on two-seat and training aircraft. And we did some bombers as well. So we would continue to make the JN-4. We would make the de Havilland DH-4, which we would repower with the Liberty engine, which we'll get to in a little bit. And we had a couple of companies Dayton Wright Fisher Body Standard Aircraft would build the DH-4s, and they would be the only American-built aircraft to see combat. So they built the 4,846 aircraft. 2,113 actually made it to Europe and saw combat. What's interesting to note is that these 3 American companies built close to 5,000 of these de Havilland DH-4s. The de Havilland company only made 1,449 of them through the course of the entire war, so 1914 through. So in 18 months, we outproduced the actual company that designed and built the plane originally. So that's the DH-4. The DH-4 was built here in Detroit at the Fisher Body plant. That picture is actually taken in the Fisher plant. That's the DH-4 going down. This photograph is also from the Fisher plant. I'm assuming this aircraft is probably a visual trainer, because you obviously would not have the weapons mounted on a plane that's not skinned. So this is probably something they had to train the new employees on, or for familiarization. DH-4 assembly. And this kind of goes into our foreshadowing of what would happen in World War II. Does this picture remind anybody of anything? Any of you guys have been following the Save the Bomber Plant Willow Run thing? Mm. 25 years later, we'd be doing that. But that was where we had to start somewhere. World War I, you also saw one of the first large influxes of women into the workplace. The auto industry had always employed women in some way, in small numbers. But World War I, you saw a major influx of women in the workplace. I think if the war had gone on and proceeded through that 1919 spring offensive, instead of celebrating Rosie the Riveter, we may have been celebrating Sally the Seamstress. But I believe this is probably a posed photo, because they're all just way too uniform and looking way too happy. But that is the Fisher Body DH-4. They're stitching up wing panels for the DH-4 assembly line at Fisher. So this is Rosie's mom. What's interesting is that at the end of the war in France, they gathered all of the surviving aircraft together at one airdrome, parked them in a big, and set them all on fire. They called it the $1 billion bonfire, but that's what happened to most of the DH-4s that were built. The ones that survived combat were burned at the end of the war. One thing I always like to point here is to the Grand Rapids Airplane Company, kind of a cool story. So they were in Grand Rapids, known for its furniture and its woodworking. There were 15 different furniture companies that got together, and they're like, you know what, this airplane is not very different from furniture, because at that time they were all cloth, and they were sticking cloth aircraft. So they got together, and they built 365 Handley Page 0400 bombers, which was the heavy bomber of that time. The entire aircraft, with the exception of the engines, was built in Grand Rapids. Some of them did make it to England before the war ended, but none of them were ever put together this time to see action. And this is an actual, and this is still the goofiest looking airplane. I mean, I don't know how that thing flew. And this is an American build, and it's got the American roundels on it. So this is so that's your Handley Page 0400. And then this is actually one of the Grand Rapids furniture companies making propellers for the war effort. And I love that balancing jig. It's so high tech, isn't it? But that's how they built them. You know, 25 years later, Nash Kelvinator in Lansing would be building aluminum propellers. So aviation engines is another place, and this is actually a place where we made an impact. The European powers, once again, were ahead of us, but none of them had a really good engine. And once again, for anybody here who's involved in logistics, it's crazy. The British had 37 engines, the French had 46 different engines, the Germans had 8 different engines. I mean, and then you have to maintain parts and spares for all of these different variants, and they're all craftsman built. They are not interchangeable. So you can't mix and match. So they come to the United States prior to the American entry into the war in 1917. This is one of the things when they actually came to us and said, hey, can you help us with airplane engines? And we did, and but one of the problems we ran into is that they were craftsman engines. And they sent, so we're like, send us drawings. So they sent us drawings, and the drawings got here, and they were in this thing called metric. Americans, I don't know that. And they were terrible drawings. I mean, there was one, I was reading one that, I believe it was for the Rhone, where the actual metallurgic call-out for the cylinder head, they were, the American manufacturers said, if we make the cylinder head out of this material, it will melt when you turn that engine on. And so the drawings were wrong, the specifications were wrong, there were wide ranges, and they're like, this is just silly, what are we going to do with this mess? So one of the things they said is just send us an engine, we'll take it apart, we'll figure it out. And that was what we did with a bunch of them. But that takes time. You got to do metallurgic studies, you got to measure everything, you got to take it apart, you've got to get more than one example since these things are all kind of handmade. You know, the Hispano-Suiza engine took 13 months to reverse engineer, the Lerone took 8 months. It was, but we did it, and we were making them. We made a lot of Hispanos. We made a bunch of Lerones. We actually made some Lerones here in Detroit area. But the Americans actually did something smart and said, you know what? Forget all this nonsense. Let's design an engine. Let's make one aircraft engine, and let's make a really, really good one. Let's make it modular. Modular. We thought that was something new, right? It was modular. It was interchangeable. So they went and they grabbed 2 guys out of the industry. Anybody here familiar with E.J. Hall or Jesse Vincent? Yep. All right, we got one. So Vincent, Jesse Vincent, or both?
Jesse Vincent.
Jesse Vincent. So E.J. Hall was from Hall Scott Motor. If you're into old boats, you'll know Hall Scott. Hall Scott was the standard for marine engines for eons. They made a lot of engines for boats, and they were doing aircraft engines. So E.J. Hall had tons of experience with powerful engines. And then Jesse Vincent from Packard Motor Company right here in Detroit. Jesse Vincent's one of those guys, there's a lot of stuff on your car today that you take for granted that came out of his head that he really didn't get credit for. He's another one of those people like Kettering, people who should be household names. You know, Ford's a household name, but really Jesse Vincent, you know, Kettering, those guys should really be above them. But so they grabbed these 2 guys. Vincent had been doing a lot of work with the V12s for Packard, and these were both brilliant engine designers. So they take them and they grab a couple of French aviation advisors, and they lock them in a hotel room in Washington, D.C. at the Willard Hotel.